Okay, panelists, we're now going to turn to KinGap and the questions surrounding KinGap. I know there may be many, but there are a few I really wanted to focus on for purposes of this training. The first is, what are the benefits of encouraging relatives to get licensed early in the case? And Buffy, I'd like to have you take this one first.
Well, as it relates to KinGap, I think that one of the benefits of encouraging the relatives to get licensed early in the process is because that's going to be required if they're going to be considered for KinGap. And we don't want to have the situation come up where we could have we could finalize permanency and we've identified that guardianship is the most appropriate permanency plan, and KinGap could have been available but is not because the relative is not licensed. And from a permanency standpoint, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, the licensing process may be delayed. And so if they're already licensed, then we don't have to have that issue and that potential delay later on in the case.
And Ross, what role, from your perspective, does the court play in not just guardianship, but KinGap?
So I think it's important to note that in order to be eligible for the 4E funding for KinGap, it is dependent on those original court orders right at the beginning of the case that makes the child 4E eligible. And so that is the most important role of the court, is making sure those initial court orders are correct and complete so that you have 4E eligibility. That's going to enhance the ability to make KinGap a possible assistance program for that family. And then also, as we've talked in some of the other trainings about the importance of concurrent plans versus concurrent planning. And so the court can be asking questions. If there is a concurrent plan of guardianship, let's be asking, is the potential guardian a relative? Are they working on getting licensed? How long has the youth been in the home? All of these facts are important to establishing the KinGap eligibility. The agency determines whether an individual is eligible for KinGap. That's the federal law and regulations. And so a court order can't necessarily make a child eligible for KinGap or not. But those questions and those quality court hearings and figuring out, okay, agency and team that's surrounding this child, are we really making good efforts towards this permanency plan of a guardianship, and can we make KinGap assistance program available to the family as we go forward?
Right, to those points that Ross has made, Jenny, what do you do if a party asks the court to order KinGap, or if the court decides to order KinGap? How do you handle that in practice?
Well, I think you have to explain to the court and direct the court to the statute and what the statutory requirements are. First off, KinGap is not a permanency plan. The permanency plan is guardianship. KinGap is merely the subsidy to provide the guardian financial assistance through that program. So I think it's really important to note, and this kind of dovetails off of what Ross was saying, is that when the court is making a consideration of whether or not guardianship should be a permanency plan, is the financial assistance required? Has the agency made a determination that the proposed guardian has met all of the statutory and federal requirements to be eligible for the KinGap program? And the reason that this is so important is that if a family really does need that financial assistance, say they're getting foster care payments now, and they want to do the guardianship, it looks like it's in the best interest of the child to do that guardianship, but they need that financial assistance. Before the court orders a permanency plan of guardianship, the agency should have already made a determination as to whether or not they qualify or not. And the reason that's important is if the court orders guardianship as the permanency plan, and then the agency does its analysis and determines they don't qualify for the program, you're going to lose several months of permanency time for that child, because the matter is going to have to be brought back to court to inform the court that guardianship is not a viable option for the guardian and that we need to look for an alternative permanency plan.
Any last thoughts about KinGap or any of the topics that have been covered? And I'd like to ask Buffy if you could go first, and then Jenny, and then we'll hear from Ross.
Sure. I find it interesting about courts trying to order that KinGap be available to the guardian, or order KinGap as a guardianship, or order KinGap as a permanency plan. And I think one of the ways I would approach the court is to kind of obviously point out the federal statute that clearly specifies that it's the agency's role. But I never heard courts get involved in adoption subsidies and talking to and trying to order the agency to provide an adoption subsidy or not provide an adoption subsidy. And the KinGap funding mechanism is very much similar to the adoption subsidy. So, I think this education is helpful in that, to remind everybody that this is simply a funding source, and it's one that has very specific requirements. So I think going back to all of the things that we've talked about over the course of time of these various trainings is planning, facts, digging into the information, and looking at it all from the perspective of the best interest of the child. And then realizing that all stakeholders have a role, but that role is different depending on which stakeholder you are. So I think KinGap is great in that it's available now, because I can't tell you how many times we've said, oh, we have to have adoption because they need the funding. I mean, that's, I think, what led to probably KinGap coming about, and those severing legal relationships. But that being said, is we still have to use it appropriately and recognize the appropriate person or agency around determining whether or not KinGap is appropriate and available in this particular circumstance. Lastly, one of the things that I worry about as we look toward increasing our availability and use of guardianship is the permanency aspect of it. In Nevada, we do not have any such thing as a permanent guardianship. We'll hear about, we're going to order a permanent guardianship, but nothing in the law makes it permanent. And that is one of the key considerations when we're looking at any permanency plan, is the permanence of it. And that applies whether it's KinGap or not KinGap. So I just want to always remind people that that's one of the things that we have to look at when we're determining whether or not guardianship is the appropriate plan.
Jenny, and could you comment, Jenny? I want you to have the last opportunity before Ross to comment, but I would suggest that from a worker's perspective who's doing all of the work to see that the KinGap requirements are met, I'm just going to say from my legal perspective, it's somewhat tedious. I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's a lot of work. There are a lot of specific details that have to be checked off, which is one reason I believe a party can't just say, oh, just order at court, or a court just can't say, oh, I'm going to order that you pay KinGap. I think there's a lot of details that must be checked off before the eligibility requirements are met. Jenny.
Yes, that's absolutely correct, Ashley. The statute, as well as federal law, provides for very specific requirements. It requires that the child be that the home be licensed for 6 months. Not only that the home be licensed, but the child reside in the home as a licensed home for 6 months. That's one of the key requirements. I do a lot of help the agency with a lot of reviews on the requirements, and it's something that we constantly see, that because the homes aren't getting licensed early on in the process, by the time they come up for KinGap, they haven't met that 6-month requirement. It also has to be determined that adoption or reunification is not an option for the child, it's determined by the agency. That's something that we see to order, that it is in the best interest of the child for the KinGap, but that's not how the statute and the federal law is written. It really requires the agency to make that determination. So there's also other requirements such as fingerprinting, background check, and so forth, which if they're already licensed, they should have gone through, and as long as nothing has occurred, it's more of a formality. But it does take quite a bit of work and analysis of the totality and facts and circumstances of the case in determining if it's in the best interest of the child. Something else that I did want to point out, since we're talking about statutory specifics, is that KinGap law does allow that if a sibling of the child resides in the same home and is already qualified for KinGap, even if the second sibling does not meet the criteria, they can be qualified under the program. And I know that's a little convoluted, so let me give you an example. Let's say you had a child that was in the system and was placed with grandma and went achieved permanency under a KinGap guardianship. And a year later, the parents gave birth to another child that came into the system, and we were not able to achieve reunification a second time, and grandma chose not relicensed the second time. Because the first child qualified for KinGap, the second child will qualify for KinGap as well. So I think that's something that's important for community stakeholders to understand about the program as well.
Thank you, Jenny. Ross?
I think I would like just really to echo Buffy's comments about that KinGap is a great tool, but to note that guardianship is not as permanent as adoption, which is why I think you see the federal requirement that the adoption and reunification be ruled out. I think we, as a system in Nevada, originally took that requirement to mean like, well, you better try to get a TPR and have it denied, and then maybe you are eligible for KinGap. Through this process of the federal review, they made it very clear, like, no, it just needs to be an agency determination that adoption or reunification is ruled out. You don't have to actually like attempt and fail, and so that makes it more likely that the determination will be made that the child is eligible. But I think some real good questions about, and for the court and the team in the courtroom, like, what is the most appropriate permanency plan? And if adoption can be achieved, let's go for adoption, because that's permanent, that's solid. Whereas the guardianship is less so. And I think when they set it up, they didn't want, just like everyone to go wild and crazy with guardianships all over the place, right? The main focus again is that permanency and stability that's in the best interest of the child. So, and also to echo what Buffy said, is like, we don't see courts getting involved in adoption subsidies. And so if you think about KinGap as the financial program, just like an adoption subsidy, that can help the court really maintain focus on those items that are critical to be discussing and making rulings on in the court, as opposed to going off kind of on this tangent and try to determine, federal financial eligibility. That, as Jennifer said, it's really complicated, and we have our staff trained on how to go through it. And then, so really, I guess just in terms of KinGap and in terms of all the topics we've covered, is for courts and all the attorneys, everyone has a role in that courtroom, and to make sure you're diving down into the right questions. And note that, that although the KinGap is an important piece to that understanding what that status is, there's almost nothing that can happen in the courtroom that's going to impact it. So use that court hearing time wisely on those items that are really critical that a court be examining and making findings on.
All right, thank you. Certainly child welfare law is a complex area of law. There are a lot of nuances. So I'm extremely grateful to the three of you for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and all of the thoughts around these different topics and how to best practice. Thank you for that as panelists.